I mean, and I'll just do it very informally, probably. I wrote this paper. I think, unlike most people, I wrote a paper in April 2020, and I haven't changed it. I was tempted to write a new paper, but I thought life is short. So it's historically interesting for me because it shows how much has happened since April 2020, because the paper basically posits the problem that I had with Ernest's work, that he didn't seem to have solved the Weber-Gellner problem of disenchantment. And I was at that point posing the problem. And why I like Gellner and why I think he's great is that he actually asks the interesting questions. His answers are not always very satisfying, but he was one of the few thinkers who, when you were listening to him, you felt, well, these are the, as Aldous Huxley might say, the perennial philosophy. This is the perennial, these are the big questions which we need to answer. And it's in the Enlightenment tradition. These are the questions which David Hume and others would have asked. And it's very easy nowadays to lose those big questions. But he went on obstinately. He was a kind of Einstein. He never grew up. And he went on asking the big why questions and drawing on three disciplines to try and answer them, which makes his answers very interesting. And so he posed my question, and this paper shows how he posed it. What has happened since then are two things. One is that I've become more aware of why his answers are so limited to a European and Western context, because he was trained and his background was in the philosophy and history of the West, as was mine. So he is in the great tradition from the Greeks through Christianity to philosophy, through Judaism, and therefore he thinks in those categories. He thinks in Western categories, binary categories, monotheistic categories. His central work is on various kinds of monotheism, Islam, Marxism, which is another form of monotheism, and so on. So he is within that. Now, in order to understand 2/3 of the world, as I point out in my paper, you have to get out of that way of thinking, because they don't think like that. They think in a yin-yang, quantum, both-and philosophical way, which is totally inimical and contrary to our Western way of thinking. So to me, Gellner is Einstein. He asked the right questions and he came up with some very satisfying partial solutions. But like Einstein, he was then faced with quantum theory. And for a long time, he said, this is impossible. You don't play dice, etc. He couldn't wrap his mind around it because he felt that all the foundations of Western philosophy and science couldn't deal with the uncertainties of a quantum world. And my feeling is that when I talked to him a little bit about his time in Japan and other things, by the time he had died, he was still not in a position to have wrapped his mind around the East, India, and particularly China and Japan. Therefore, he was rejecting it. It's impossible, it's rubbish. And all his stuff about relativism and we mustn't be too charitable. He would have said, Alan, you're being too kind to these people. They speak rubbish and you mustn't listen to them. Well, you can't understand 2/3 of the world if you do that. So I think he was, until he had shifted a lot, I think, if he'd been younger and if he'd spent time there, he was a big enough mind to have encompassed it and understood it, but he didn't get to that phase. So that's one caveat, or what I've realized over the last year. The second thing is that I realized the solution to the Weber-Gellner problem. And the solution to the Weber-Gellner problem is that, which is that you have a coin and you have either rationality or you have integration. You have either Gemeinschaft or you have Gesellschaft. You can't have both. We have a cage. Now, my solution is that having, which isn't in my paper, but I've discovered since, and is that I came back from discovering the enchantment, and then I looked round and I found that we have enchantment, we have both and, we have yin and yang, but we do it in a different way, which I call oasis or bubble enchantment. In other words, we use our imaginations to create integration. And we do it, as I explain in part of my autobiography, through the arts of enchantment, through art, through games, through playing, through all these sorts of things. And therefore, we live as enchanted a life. Basically, that's the second point I'm going to make and elaborate a bit. That Ernest manifested this Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft kind of contradiction in his life, not merely in his intellectual Weberian and cage thing, but also socially. I mean, it was an interesting thing about Ernest, that he both wanted to be in the club and outside the club. I mean, I saw this in Cambridge when he came to Cambridge. He both very much cherished and liked being in King's College and in the department, but he also resented being kind of his freedom and individuality being hampered in some way. So he was like sort of a schoolboy who both wants to join in the game, but also wants to be standing on the touchline. And I think you find this actually as a wider feature of his work. I mean, what unites most of his work is attack on all kinds of closed systems. I'm surprised no one made this point. I mean, basically the Popperian problem, because if you look at his work, his attack on psychoanalysis, postmodernism, Islam, communism and Marxism, and even when he attacks people like Chomsky or other thinkers, it's whenever anything becomes too certain and circumscribed and controlling his mind and personality, he rebels against it and tries to break it down. But it ties him up in knots, because then he gets into becoming a sort of an authoritarian figure in relation to relativism and so on and so on. You know, he says relativists are wrong and so on. So, you know, it's like all problems of freedom, you know, how far do you tolerate and so on.